Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.
Hello, welcome to Northern Lights. I'm Mollie Hoben, and we are at Minnesota Women's Press, where I'm a co-publisher. And our guest today is Valerie Miner. Welcome, Valerie.
Thank you.
Great to have you here.
Great to be here.
We're going to talk about Valerie's new book, which is been nominated for a Minnesota Book Award, her third nomination. And we're going to talk about many of her other books and how she became a writer and all the kinds of interesting things that we like to find out when we've got access to a writer. So we'll go at it. Valerie Miner has published 10 books and is published stories and essays in numerous anthologies, pages and pages of publications. Her latest book is The Low Road, came out in 2001 and has been nominated for the Minnesota Book Award 2002 in the memoir and autobiography category. It's a beautiful book, a very moving book, and Valerie, I know you've been traveling around the country a lot with this. What kind of reactions are you getting to this?
I've been getting a lot of very touching reactions. People seeing their own family stories, their own lost aunts and uncles, and people have been responding to the different voices. As you know, it's a polyphonic book, which uses 4 different voices. My voice is the first person present, and then the more distant you get from me, the more distant the voice gets. So the voice of my mother is the first person past, and the voice of my grandmother is third person past, and the voice of my grandfather is part of a conversation, a kind of poetic second person. And I think people have really liked that too, the kind of chorus involved.
At first when I was reading it, I thought, oh, am I going to keep these straight? But I realized soon on that wasn't a problem at all, and I was pulled into each character and had a feel for the character by the voices. We should back up a little bit, and the subtitle of this book is A Scottish Family Memoir. Do you have can you tell us just very briefly what this book is and how it came to be? And I was really moved in your introduction or preface where you said that this is the book you've been writing all your life, and I thought, whoa, that says something. So tell us about that as well.
Yeah, the other part of that sentence is, this is the book I'll never know enough to write.
Yes, that's very haunting.
It's a book that didn't start out as a book. It started out as a search for my family. The potted version of the story is that my mother was born in Edinburgh in 1910. Her mother was Mrs. Mackenzie, who was married to Mr. Mackenzie, and her father was Mr. Campbell, who was married to Mrs. Campbell. And of course, this was a great scandal. My mother was named a Mackenzie, and then my grandparents had another child together. And
still married to their spouses.
That's right. And then they moved into a one-room tenement flat from their previous one-room tenement flats by the time their third child, Colin, was born. But that meant that my grandmother left 4 children behind with Mr. Mackenzie, and my grandfather left 7 children behind with Mrs. Campbell. And what happened to those people is that, as many poor Scots did, they wound up as adults emigrating, and they went to Australia, New Zealand, Ontario, British Columbia, India, Miami, New York. And as I said, for the first 30 years, this really wasn't a book. It was just my going around the world, literally, trying to find some of these aunts and uncles and trying to piece together a story, because my mother was very ashamed. She felt that being illegitimate was a very, very shameful thing. And so it took me a very long time to just get the basic facts. And I really couldn't start writing the book, and didn't even think of it as a book until after my mother and her siblings had died.
Yeah. You said that you first started trying to write it as a novel.
That's
and because most of your published books are novels, but you're also a journalist by training. You're a professor at the University of Minnesota of English and creative writing. You've written essays. And it seems to me that what you finally ended up with, all of those pieces of you are in here, because it's a very interesting structure. You call it a cross-genre narrative. Tell us about that, and how did you get from writing a novel to writing this very layered and interesting book?
Well, my friends for years have been telling me this was the novel that I was meant to write, and I thought, oh, right, you know, once I decided I would do it, and once I'd recovered from the death of my mother, I thought, right, this one will be no trouble. The story's already written.
And it's a great story.
But of course it was big trouble, because all of those echoes of censorship and self-censorship kept coming in at me. And also because I realized that unlike a novel, which for me has to be a process of discovery for the writer as well as the reader, I start out with characters and I know them fairly well, and I have a sense of the roads they might take. But unless they surprise me, they don't become vital, and the book isn't going to work. And with this story, this was a story about real people who had suffered enormously, who had been extraordinarily brave, who had ordinary but very consequential lives. And it wasn't being, the muse wasn't my guardian angel or my subconscious. It was really the lives of my family. And I thought that the best way to honor that would be to write it as a memoir. The difficulty, of course, is that my grandparents, who were extremely poor people, left virtually no records. There were no wills or deeds or letters or documents. There were 2 pictures, one of my grandfather with 2 uncles who were not identified, and one of my grandmother behind a dark veil. And so in order to find out the story of my grandparents, I spent a lot of time in Edinburgh, to which I'd been going back and forth for over 30 years, but I spent 3 concentrated periods of time researching what the lives of working class people were like in the mid to late 1900s and early 20th century. And I looked through archives and went to the map library and got maps of where my family would have lived at this point in their lives, and that point and that point. And actually they were very instructive, because you could find out, you know, there was a pub on the corner and there was a grocer down the street. I looked at voter records. I did birth and death records, census records, very helpful. And so out of that, and out of reading a lot of Scottish history, I was able to create a fictional story about my grandparents. But it's really based on very, very slim memories that I received from my mother about her parents, and on the little bits of documentation that I was able to get. And that's why I call it cross-genre, because I see it as a book that is a memoir, and I don't think the fiction is necessarily any less true than the memory in the book. But I want to acknowledge that this story about my grandparents comes from my imagination and as well as my research.
So although you did not write a novel, you used your skills as a novelist as part of writing this book.
That's
clearly.
Right. And I find that as a novelist, I always use my skills as a journalist. I mean, all my novels have a lot of research involved in them. I don't seem to be able to get away from social issues and the historical moments. So,
When we talked with a New Zealand writer, Fiona Kidman, Dame Fiona Kidman, one of the best respected writers there, and she said that she felt that a writer, whatever she was writing, was paying attention, was writing out of what she called the central dramas of her life, and that Kidman said she could look back at all her books and see that no matter what they were, there were a couple of themes that just she was working on, and she didn't even know it at the time, perhaps. Does that ring true, and do you see that in the things you've done?
Well, I think that is true. I don't tend to write directly autobiographically. I mean, this, of course, is an autobiography. It's a memoir. But most of my books start with curiosity about imaginary characters and philosophical or moral or political dilemmas. For instance, Blood Sisters is about Irish women and the IRA, and A Walking Fire is about a working-class American family during the Vietnam War and the different choices the siblings in that family made about the war. But I have found that as I look back on my books that three things are really important. One is that I'm very, very interested in friendship, and of course I have wonderful friends. It never occurred to me, though, that that was a theme of my work until I looked back on it. And another important aspect is that I write about working class lives. And I'd say that was a more conscious aspect of the content of these books. And another thing is that they're all very strongly about place in some way. Range of Light was particularly inspired by the high Sierras, the high-altitude glacier-skinned mountains in eastern California. Really wanted to write about those mountains and what they did to people when people spent concentrated periods of time there. But that's the only book that really started out about a place. But if you look at A Walking Fire, the coast of Oregon is very vivid there. In Winter's Edge, the Tenderloin in San Francisco is a very strong element. In Blood Sisters, it's set in London during the 1970s, a period during which I lived in London. It's a very, and of course there are more Irish people in London than there are in England than there are in Ireland. So it's a very London book. Clearly The Low Road, although it takes us to India and Australia and Canada, New Zealand and so forth, it's a very Edinburgh book.
Yeah, that's right. So you grew up in a working class family. Your parents obviously were, and their parents were working class. How did you get from there to being an academic middle class writer who's still very much paying attention to what it means to live a working class life? How did that process happen? It's not one that one assumes necessarily.
Well, I don't know. And I think it was as big a surprise to my family as it was to me. I went to Berkeley in the 1960s, and that was an enormous gift because it was a public university. I was a work-study student, but still the tuition in those days was very cheap. And I woke up intellectually and artistically at Berkeley. I, at the time, I was an English literature major, and I loved fiction and wanted to write it, but I wasn't reading stories about people like my people, working class people. I wasn't reading stories about women. I mean, I took a course about the 19th century British literature, never read the Brontes. The closest I seemed to get at Berkeley to being able to do a thesis on a woman was to do my thesis on Walt Whitman. So in many ways it didn't seem to be territory, working class lives, women's lives, for fiction, and journalism was drawing me forward in for another reason. And the other reason was that it was a politically exciting time, and I thought I could participate actively as a journalist. And I had the opportunity to work in Canada and England and Tanzania and have some extraordinary encounters with people like Julius Nyerere. So I'm very grateful for those years as a journalist. But during those years, the early 1970s, I also met the women's movement, and more books were coming out, and I would read Margaret Atwood and Toni Morrison and Doris Lessing, and I got excited about women's stories. And it was really through reading those books and then being in women's writers' groups where, first of all, I co-published a collection of essays with one in Canada, a book that's still in print. This came out in 1975.
What's the name of it?
It's called Her Own Woman, And
Great
it's a
title.
series of essays, narrative essays about contemporary Canadians, then contemporary.
Yes.
And then I moved to England and was involved in a group that published a book called Tales I Tell My Mother, which came out in '78. And recently the BBC asked us to celebrate the 20th anniversary of that book by each writing news stories, which they then produced on the air.
Oh, cool.
So those two groups were really important to my starting to write fiction.
Yeah.
And subsequently I've continued to work in women's writing groups and working on my own work.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. The sense of place that you mentioned, as well as the working. Oh, when you were talking, I was thinking that in the Low Road, it seems to me, as you were learning more about the people in your family, that you saw some glimpses of where that writing talent and interest might come. There were a couple of places where you said you didn't write, but you might have been a writer in other circumstances to someone in your past. Was that a discovery for you as you were?
Well, yes, I had the feeling that my grandfather would have been a writer from the way that the memories that my mother had of him. My grandfather died when my mother was 14. My grandmother died of a backstreet abortion when my mother was 7, and my mother remembered virtually nothing of her mother. But she remembered a great deal about her father, was very fond of him, and he died when she was 14, at which point she went out to work in a dance hall. But her memories of him were of him reading her Robert Louis Stevenson, of being interested in writing. And so, yes, I think that there is some gene there somewhere.
Yes, it came down. Yeah, that's great. Huh. You mentioned place as another one of the themes that you see in your work as you look back, and it's interesting to know how much you've lived in many different places, but you grew up in California, right?
Well, sort of.
Sort of.
Yeah,
You
I was
moved
born
around.
in Manhattan.
That's right. And then moved to California when you were a child, or?
I moved out west to Washington State, and then eventually moved to California when I went to high school in California and university.
Then to college when you were in California. All right. And you've been in Minnesota since?
Since '92.
Since '92.
Yeah.
So, and you've traveled a lot. You said you spent years in Britain, in Canada. You've traveled most recently to India on a Fulbright.
That's right.
To Australia.
That's right.
So, how does place seem to you? I mean, do you have a place that is, this is home, and the rest of the places are where I am, and I write from that place, or are each of these places something that you're writing from now, or how does it work?
Well, it's a very good question, and one of the things that I learned after the fact as I read through my work was that throughout all of these books, I'm dealing with questions about the difference between settlement and trespassing, between my home and your home. You know, for instance, I currently the place I do think of as one of my homes. One of them, of course, is Minneapolis, and then I have a wonderful cabin in Mendocino, California. But I'm very, very conscious of the Pomo people who lived there before the Europeans came. But I think that this is probably symbolized in the titles of a couple of my books. One of my books of stories is called Trespassing, and half the stories are set in the U.S. and half are set in Kenya and Morocco and Norway and so forth.
And that was your first?
That was my first collection of stories, but then I also did a novel in stories called Movement, which was my very first book. And that takes a woman named Susan through 10 years of different kinds of spiritual, political, geographical movement, and does take her also around the world. So movement, trespassing, I think, place has always been both a problem and a respite for me.
Yes. Yeah. And that's interesting to think about it again in The Low Road, which is about immigration and emigration, and how real that was in your life and close to your life. It wasn't generations back, but really a dynamic of your family.
That's right. I mean, I think it's important for me to it was important for me to write this book, not because I was looking for my roots. I was just trying to find out who my mother was, and in some senses who I was. And speaking of place, I think that the title is worth
that's good.
discussing briefly. The title comes from a song on the Bonnie Bonnie Banks of Loch Lomond, and there's a line in it, ye tak the high road and I'll tak the low road and I'll get to Scotland before ye. There's a Celtic tradition that if you die outside the homeland, whether you're Welsh or Cornish or Scottish or any other kind of Celt, your soul returns home on the ferry way, the underground way, the low road. And my mother and most of her 13 brothers and sisters returned on the low road.
Yes, didn't get back to Scotland while they were alive.
That's right. Yeah.
We were talking before about the cover of the book, which is a wonderful painting. Your mother was a waitress when she came here. Tell about how you discovered this, because I think it's a great story.
I was wandering around 57th Street one day and looking at the galleries, and there was an exhibit of Raphael Sawyer's paintings. He and Moses Sawyers were twin brothers who painted New York realist scenes in the early to mid-century. And this was actually the postcard. This cover was made into a postcard to advertise the exhibit. And I turned the postcard over, and it said, Waitresses, 1930. And my mother immigrated to New York in 1930.
Yes.
So I kept it over my desk, and once the book was finished, I sent it to the press, and I said, how about this? And they said, you bet.
Ah, that was great. You were meant to find that and be in that spot.
Yeah.
That's great. So what's coming up next for you? What you have projects underway, or are you got ideas churning?
Well, I'm working on two projects. I'm interested in taking classical stories and revisiting them. So, for instance, Blood Sisters is a rewrite of Hamlet, and A Walking Fire is a rewrite of Lear from Cordelia's point of view. And right now, I'm looking at Paradise Lost and trying to look at some of the issues of settlement and trespassing and paradise, and whose paradise is it. And so I'm turning that kind of upside down, setting it in a contemporary women's community. And I'm also putting together a collection of stories, some of which have come out on the BBC and some of which have come out in literary journals. And I'll probably kind of come to closure at the same time with both of those books.
And a couple of your books are coming back in print, you said, and this is exciting. Tell us about those.
Blood Sisters, the book about Irish women and the IRA, and Trespassing, the collection of stories I mentioned.
And it's Michigan State
Michigan
Press?
State University Press. They were not the original publishers of them, but they're going to be putting them out in paperback, so I'm very happy.
So people can find them soon, hopefully.
Yes,
yes. That's great. You've got a wonderful legacy here of published things, and when you came today before we set up to start doing this interview, and we were walking through the Women's Press offices, and one of our young staff people said, Valerie, and she was one of your students, and clearly it was a thrill for her to see you, which reminds me that another piece of your legacy, I assume, must be the sense of writers that you teach and work with, and how does that fit in with your own writing?
Oh, it's a great joy. I love working with the students at the U, and I find that I learn a lot from them. You know, in an ideal world, I actually would like to have a slightly lighter teaching load.
Okay.
So if the governor is listening, I don't make more money than the governor, but I'd like to have a slightly lighter teaching load, but still be able, especially to do the thesis work with the graduate students and with the undergraduate students. That's so rewarding. And I find that they provoke me. You know, they say, well, why do writers do this? And I think, well, why do writers do that? And sometimes I think, well, we don't have to do that. They make me think in new directions, for instance, about revision. I was concerned about the fact that a lot of my students seemed allergic to revision. So I started to write an essay about the pleasures that I got from revision. Yeah, so actually they've inspired me in my topics and in my process and in my style.
Yes,
It's been very mutual.
And when you were in India just a year and a half ago, you were working with students who were writers.
That's right, yes, and I'm still in touch with a number of them on email, and that's terrific.
Must be great.
Yeah.
All right. So you've got several projects underway. You continue teaching. You get some time to get to your cabin once in a while. Is that a writing place, or is that a...
It's a writing place.
It's a writing place.
Yeah,
So
without a telephone.
Very good.
Yes.
Yeah. Force yourself there to be able to focus. That's great. Well, our time is running out, and we're just getting started. We could talk about many other things. I do want to encourage, I can give a very heartfelt recommendation. Encourage people to pick up The Low Road and read it. It's a moving, very beautifully crafted story, which is about your family and a beautiful memoir of you and your mother. And as you told me, one of your editors said it's so wonderful to have a mother-daughter relationship where they like one another, and that certainly comes through. But it's a beautifully written book. I encourage people to pick it up and look for Valerie's other books. We talked about the couple that are going to be coming out soon. Some are still in print. Range of Light, which was mentioned before. It was the Minnesota Book Award nominee 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And what else is in print quickly that we can tell people?
A Walking Fire, Rumors from the Cauldron, Winter's Edge.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
So a lot of good books of Valerie's to read. If you haven't read her, you're in for a great surprise. And if you have read her and haven't gotten to her latest book yet, be sure and read that. Thanks so much for coming in. It's been really fun talking with you.
It's been a pleasure.
Great. One of the fun things about talking with Valerie about The Low Road and reading it was to think again about Scotland and the lives of women there, and think about books by Scottish women writers that we've read here at Minnesota Women's Press. We have taken several trips, book groups, on the road to Scotland, and one book that was that moved us all was a book called Finding Peggy, written by Meg Henderson, who's a journalist in Glasgow. And like Valerie in The Low Road, she was looking for information for the story of her aunt and her mother's mother, and knew there was something had happened and there was a secret, and she didn't know what it was, and she was trying to find it. And this is a memoir about her own growing up in working class Scotland. A couple of other writers who we've read when we were in Scotland and have loved and have called great books here at Minnesota Women's Press. One is called The Fires of Bride, by Ellen Galford, who's actually American, who's lived in Edinburgh for about 30 years, I think, and has written a couple of wonderful books. And this one is set on one of the islands of Scotland, and our groups loved reading this. And another is a woman named Elspeth Barker, who wrote a book called O Caledonia, a haunting, moving book about a 16-year-old girl and her death. And it won a prize as first novel in Britain, and is, again, well worth finding. Now, these books aren't easy to find, but if you get a chance to look for them, I encourage you. What we found at the Women's Press when we do these book groups on the road is that going to some place, having read women writers who are from that place and writing about it, makes the trip so much more richer, and in the process makes our reading, as we talk about it, so much more exciting. And so we've found that we like traveling and reading together, and we do it every year. This year we're going to Iceland, as well as Taos and the North Shore. And if you're interested, we invite you to think about joining us. And be sure and read the Women's Press newspaper, the independent feminist voice of Minneapolis and Minnesota, and read our publication, Book Women, if you're into books. Thank you for joining us.
Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.